I'll start out discussing, I'll mention some of the concerns if you're upgrading from a version of Delphi earlier than 2009 and a suggestion that I have in that scenario. Then I'm going to review changes in the DataSnap architecture and features that impact your application's implementation with the new DBX DataSnap. I'll walk through changes that may be necessary in your server's project, the server's remote data modules, and the client application. Then I'm going to introduce a technique that I use on a stateful server to separate the state information from the connection. And that was very important for me based on the architecture that we were using with our DCOM DataSnap and having child data modules. And then finally, I discussed testing and troubleshooting issues that I experienced after the initial migration. I'm going to start with, I'll have several slides to start with, and then I'll switch to the IDE and actually walk through a migration of an existing project. So if your current DCOM DataSnap server is using a version of Delphi that's earlier than 2009, I recommend that you stay with DCOM while you complete your migration to the newer version of Delphi. Because that migration has its own set of hurdles, such as the string changing from ANSI to Unicode and the type library editor now using riddle format instead of the binary type TLB format. Accomplishing that migration first before the DBX migration will simplify things, I believe. DataSnap differences between COM and DB Express. COM clients use the type library to early bind server calls and query interface to late bind server calls. The type library is no longer used, including the riddle and TLB files. Most of the TLB pass file is no longer necessary, although some pieces, such as enumerated constants, may be. Methods that are callable from a client are no longer required to live in the remote data module. Although the remote data module is still usable, it includes COM baggage that I prefer to be rid of. Common classes used for server modules are tcomponent, tdata module, and tds server methods. TDS server methods in particular provides the IAP server and MIDAS functionality that the ODCOM DataSnap provided. Properties are not accessible from a DataSnap client. As COM required getter and setter methods to be implemented for properties, this is not a major issue. Now you can just call the methods the getter and setter directly instead of accessing the property. A proxy class is now used to allow the client to early bind the server calls rather than the type library TLB pass wrapper. In 2009 and 2010, the client application is responsible for generating the proxy class. This frustrated me as I have multiple clients that connect to a DataSnap server, and I was used to when I modified my server, the server project would update the type library proxy. Now after modifying a server, the documented method of updating the proxy is to update it from a client project. This requires launching the server first and then opening your client to generate the proxy. Fortunately, Delphi XE includes a method for a server to generate its own proxy. The COM class factory is replaced with a set of DataSnap components that provide the core DataSnap server functionality, session and lifetime management, and communication transports. COM provided a mechanism for a server to automatically be launched when a client tried to access the server and the server was not already running. As we're migrating away from COM, this facility is no longer available, and DB Express DataSnap does not have a replacement. Only DB Express supported data types can be used as parameters or return values for the server methods. Many Delphi and COM data types are not supported. The blog post below gives the list of the basic types supported by DB Express DataSnap. The blog does not include JSON objects, which were added with Delphi 2010. And by the way, all my slides and the source code of the project I'm going to put up on Code Central early next week. The safe call calling convention is not supported. This is important since all methods implemented from a type library use the safe call calling convention. If your server methods use the safe call directive, Delphi 2009 and 2010 will throw an internal error during the compile. Delphi XE silently skips these methods. And then there was some initial concern that COM style callbacks were not supported. In a COM DataSnap server, you're able to do a callback to the client so that the server can send the client messages. But what this is actually doing is you're implementing a small COM server inside your client application, and your server application is connecting back to that server that's running in the client. So it's kind of both applications are servers and clients. One's a server client of the other. You can still do this with the DB Express DataSnap. You simply need to create a small DBX server in your client application and allow your server application to connect back to that server. There are lightweight callbacks that are available in DB Express DataSnap for 2010 and XE. However, a lightweight callback is only available during a server method call. So if I call a server method, then that method needs to provide some feedback, like some progress feedback to the client. That's a good use for a lightweight callback. But you can't use them so that the server can just randomly make a call to your client application. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the IDE and let's do a migration. I created a DCOM application, server and client, for this session, and I'll go through those quickly. Oh, go away. So this is a DCOM server application. It's a VCO forms application, so when it runs, you get this form up. I've got a primary data module, which has a database and ADO database connection in it. And I've got support for child data modules because our server application had that, and that was a challenge that we had to go through. The only method in this data module is connect, which takes a database name and creates the connection to the database. Everything else you see is either supporting the COM side or it's supporting the child data modules. I have a base child data module because, again, this was the approach that was set up for creating child data modules under the DCOM DataSnap configuration. So my two child data modules, there's one that's an account, and I have an ADO dataset and a dataset provider. I also have a server method that returns just the account name for the account that I'm looking up. And then I have another data module for document with an ADO dataset that returns back a document list, and that has a dataset provider. And then the second dataset, get count by type, returns count the number of documents that are in the database, but that's implemented through a server call. So that dataset's not actually published. Switch to the client application quickly. We've got a data module that contains the DCOM connection, the shared connections for the child data modules, a couple client data sets, and dataset sources. That all provides functionality to the main form, where I can connect to a database, look up an account based on an account key. I can then get a dataset backup information from that account, get a list of the documents from the database, and then get the count of documents based on a particular document type. Just to see the DCOM version in action. Oh, I just love doing this live. Oh. Is it already? That was interesting. I bet you this guy was connected. Sorry about that. Run the server application. Let's do this. Okay. I connect to the database, give an account key. Hey, that's me. Let's try another account. Hi, Anders. I can get account information for the account that I just looked up, getting back a data set containing several fields, get a list of documents from the database, including the document name, and way over here there's the document size. And then for any given document type, I can look to see there are two unknowns. See, we have 93,000 Word documents, 11 Excel. Okay, moving on. That's how that little server, that little application works. In my DB Express folder, I've actually copied the COM application as is. So we're still looking at the COM version. I just made a second copy so that I can do the migration instead of doing it against the original conversion. So to begin with, there are some changes you should make at the project level. The riddle file in the top library are no longer used, so we can remove that from the project. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the TLB pass file, the majority of it is not used. However, if your top library contained enumerated constants was one area that we needed, and there may be some other areas depending on your server, there may be some things in this TLB pass file that you want to maintain. But you can get rid of the header down to the interface section, and you can get rid of the uses clause and all of the interface definitions, declarations. Now here's a enumerated type with some constants that I had in my server. TLA num is not supported by DBX DataSnap. However, the easy solution is to replace that with simply an integer, and that works well. Now the rest of this is the interface definitions, which we no longer need. And below that, all of the COM factory stuff, which we also no longer need, because we're not creating any COM objects. Now to avoid confusion, I'm going to rename this server const, because those are my server constants. Okay, next, I'm going to add a data module to hold the DataSnap components that the server needs. On the data module, we need a DS server component, and then you'll need a communication handler, TCP or HTTP, or you could use both. I'm going to use the TCP server transport, and my server will talk to the client over pure TCP. And then for each data module that you will need to have one server class component. So I will need 3 of those. Excuse me, sorry. Now my transport component needs to be connected to the server component so that it knows which data server to work with. By default, the data server or the DataSnap server is set to auto start. So when a user connects into the server, rather than having a COM factory create your remote data module or your server class, the server class component does that for you. And knows, in order to know which class to create or which data module to create, you implement the onGet class event. In the onGet class event, the parameter persistent class, you assign the class that you want created. I need to add to my uses clause the units containing my remote data modules so that I can now assign those. Let's see. And to keep me from getting confused later, let's just quickly name these. I have the primary, account, and document. And implement the onGet class for each of those. And just save all and see if those go away. Now this is the data module that I created to hold the DataSnap components that I need to save. When you create a new DataSnap project from scratch, they call this unit the server controller. So that's what I'll call it. Now for each of these server class components, they also need to be associated with a server component. Now I've got everything all hooked up, and my data modules connected into the new DataSnap architecture. However, each of my data modules need to be cleaned up because there's a lot of stuff there that I no longer need. For starters, the component factory is not needed, and if that's the only thing in the initialization section, just take the whole section out. There's also a update registry call, which is no longer needed because that updates the COM registry settings. Just rip that out. I'm going to clean up my uses clause. There are some COM units that are no longer needed. And for my development, I found that I do not need standard VCL. Now, your server may have had custom code that you wrote that requires those units. Since one of the goals is to migrate away from COM, any code that requires those units, I recommend that code is reviewed to see if you can get away from COM completely. Now for my TLB pass, I still need to reference that because that contains my new server constants. Okay, so my primary data module included support for child data modules. And although DataSnap Server gives us a way to have multiple data modules, it's no longer a parent-child type relationship. So I'm going to remove the code that provided that functionality to the DCOM server. And the last thing is we're no longer using interfaces, so I can remove that from the class definition. And it looks like save call. Remove save call from all the server methods. Now we don't have a type library to tell COM or to tell the client, hey, what server methods are available. The way that the DB Express DataSnap does this is by looking at the method information for any server methods that are public. So any methods that you need accessible from your client application should be moved from the protected section to the public section. Okay. Now let me see if I can quickly handle my child data modules. Moving the COM units. Change this to server const. In my interface. need to update the registry. For the child data modules, under the DCOM scenario, we assigned the component factory to a global variable so that we could access that from the main data module. So for my child data modules, that's no longer used. Update registry is no longer used. I almost forgot the safe call. And move this to protected or to public. And get rid of my component factory. And the paper that will be included in the code has these steps listed out. And one more to go. By golly, I'm getting kind of efficient at this. Now, cross my fingers, I should be able to compile my DataSnap server. And I can't. Oh. I've got a unit that's still referring to the TLB. Oh. I no longer need the base child data module at all. So I should remove that from my project. Thank you. Good reminder. On my child data modules, those are inherited originally from the base child. I need to remove that inheritance. Forgot that step. So I'll change each of them to inherit from remote data module, which is what we were using previously. And then in the DFM, I need to change the inherited, get this back to object, so form inheritance is no longer being used. And that happens every now and then, that's kind of odd. Oh, I still got to remove the base child. My child units are probably referring to base child. Okay. Now I mentioned earlier that I like to migrate away from the COM baggage. So instead of using T remote data module, I'm going to use TDD, or the DS server module. And to use that, I need to add DS server to my uses clause. That the DS server module provides the same IApp server functionality that the remote data module provided, but without the extra COM overhead. The COM overhead's not used, but I just prefer it not to be even linked in. So at this point, I've completely migrated my server application from DCOM DataSnap to the new DBX DataSnap and removed all of the overhead that all the COM stuff that was there. Now there's one critical component that I'll try to complete if I have time, but the main component that's missing, the main problem I have at this point, is that my child data modules are dependent upon the ADO connection of the parent data module. And I have a solution for that. I just don't know if I have time to implement it live. I may just have to run through it visually. Switching to the client. And let's start with the connection data module. Of course, we remove the DCOM connection and the shared connections. The component that the client uses for connectivity to the DataSnap server is the T-SQL connection. This is the DB Express connection. The primary thing I need to do is set the driver to DataSnap, and I also want to set login prompt to false. Now, if I look in the params for the SQL connection, here I can see where I can specify a host name for the server. My server is going to be localhost, so I'm good. The TCP port that will be used for communication, 211, is the default. If you start working on multiple DataSnap servers and you leave things at default on your development machine, things can get a little confusing. So it's always good to assign unique ports for your DataSnap servers. I'm using TCP/IP as the communication protocol, so I don't need to change that. Any of these parameters can be easily changed at design time or at runtime. For example, to set the host name. Just as an example, well, I'll show that in a little bit. I'll get back to that in a moment. So for any of my remote data modules that have a dataset provider exporting a dataset, I need to add to my client, I need to add a dataset, a provider connection, DataSnap provider connection. And I have two that have dataset providers. The account, and set that to my SQL connection. And document. Now at this point, my server is not running. If I run the server, I should be able to set connected to true and connect to the DataSnap server that's currently running. Unfortunately, there's no design time support from the provider connection to pull a list of the class names. So I have to manually enter in the class names that are on the server for those data modules. Excuse me. So what this provides is it gives a way for our client datasets to pull data from that dataset provider. Now the remote server property of the client dataset is not fetched from the server, but is actually fetched from your client application. It's the dataset the provider connection that we just created. And if I have everything hooked up right, I should be able to set active to true. And the client dataset's able to fetch data. Notice I had some, change that to our server constants. Now also, I already have. So in my search path, I have the server folder in the search path. So my old client data module had the functionality of getting the dispatches from the DCOM server, including the child data modules. Replace all that. We're no longer using interfaces. Okay, I'm not ready to go to the main form. What I was hoping to show is there's the parameters I showed that were shown at design time earlier. Set the host name, for example. Like so. Now, since we no longer have the top library pass file as a proxy for our client to know what's available from the server, we need to find an equivalent for DBX DataSnap, which DataSnap will create a client proxy class that serves that purpose. The way that works for Delphi 2009-2010 NXE is from my client application, once I have a SQL connection component, I can right-click and generate DataSnap proxy class. Now that goes and talks to the server and asks the server, hey, what functions are available to me? Now we may notice that my account data module did not show up. Or what the data module did, but the server method that's in it did not. If a server method has safe call, if it has any unsupported data types, then that server method is skipped by the DataSnap server. So it's good once you generate your proxy class to make sure that all the methods that you expect to be there are there. In this case, one is not. So I'm going to go back. Take a look. Now the blog post I mentioned earlier has the data types that are supported or not supported, but there are a couple of things that unfortunately you just have to find out the hard way. One of those is that although wide string is supported by DBX DataSnap, it's not supported as an out or a var parameter. Fortunately, string is. So that's the easy, clean solution. Get away from wide string and let's just use a good old Unicode string. Now that I've updated my server methods, anytime I've added functionality in my server methods, I need to generate new proxy. And so I need to run my server, and actually I need to run with that debug. Go back to the client data module. And I'm still connected, although I've stopped and restarted my server. So I actually need to reset my connection. Right click, generate classes. And now we can see in my account data module that the method that I expected to be there is there. Delphi XE is smart enough to remember where you generate your classes, your proxy classes to, and to update the unit automatically. I mentioned that because Delphi 2009 and 2010 did not. So each time you generated your proxy class, you got a new unit. So I'll save this as server classes, and I'm saving it in the server folder, as if I have multiple applications that access that server, they all share the same proxy class. Now for my client's data module, I want to create those proxy classes so I can access those server methods. In my after connect method, and let's just take a look at the server classes. So for each of my RDMs, I've got a client class that contains the DataSnap specific code to be able to call those server methods. And kind of ugly, but it's a quick way for me to get it done. I'm going to copy these. And I'm going to create public. Actually, no, I created them as properties. So shoot. And the server classes unit. Ah. And then in my after connect method, I need to create those classes. I'm a little copy paste happy here, but I'm trying to save some time. Oops. And that's not working out so well. Now, if you look back at the proxy class itself, the constructor requires the DBX connection, which is actually a property of the SQL connection. So we can see there's my SQL connection.dbx connection, and that's how it connects those guys back up to the server that you've connected to. And then in my before disconnect, I'm just going to free those so that I know I can't use them anymore. I would be checking appropriately if they were created in a full client application. Okay, the data module's finished. Now going back to the main form, my connect button provides connectivity. The connection, it creates the connection to the server. It's no longer primary con. That's now named SQL con. It was a DCOM connection. Now it's the T-SQL connection. I don't expect that. Oh, wait a minute. No, I don't expect that error insight to be there. Take a look at the server classes. Oh, sure enough, my primary DM should have connect method, and it does not. My apologies. Hopefully we can figure this out quickly. Ah. No, I moved it to public. Okay, another unsupported data type. And I actually put this in here on purpose and I forgot. Word bool is not a supported data type. So the easy solution is to change it to Boolean. Alright, let me go back to my data connection. SQL component. Uncheck that. I'll close my server, do a quick compile. Just hit one place, not the other. So you see it correctly updated my previously saved in, and I now have my connect method. Go back to our main form. Error insight's happy. And because I named the remote data modules in my DM, or my connection data module, because I named those components the same, everything else is just lining right up. Probably going to name the SQL connection the same too. But so now let's see if I get a clean compile client. Okay, so get account name was changed not to use write string. It's important to make sure that everything you change on your server side, you also make the same changes on the client side. Okay. DataSnap server is already running. Let's run our client. Got a connection to the server. Build lookup. Hello, Gananders. Getting data from a dataset provider. And the other server method. But I tricked you. Or maybe I didn't. The other server methods are actually working because the child data modules. Because each of those data modules has a design time ADO connection that's pointed to the same data server, or the same database server that I'm using at runtime. What really needs to happen is when the primary connection is made and its ADO connection is configured for the database, that all the other connections need to have the same connection. Under the DataSnap, under DCOM, this was easy because the primary data module was responsible for creating the children data module. So after it created it, it could call a method on the child to set the ADO connection or any other properties that you were sharing between your data module. Under DBX DataSnap, that's not the case. The server controller is responsible for creating your data modules. However, the server controller doesn't associate the connection, so that it's difficult to know when a data module has been created what other data modules may already be created for that connection. The solution that I found is that with the session lifecycle property on the DataSnap server property, on the DS server component, the lifecycle property determines how long your server class will be alive. And there are three options. I guess I can. The default of session behaves most like what I expect from a DCOM server. When a user connects in and accesses the class, it's created and it's kept alive for the life of that connection until the user disconnects. Invocation, on the other hand, the server class is created and released for each server call. So once a user connects in, they call one method, a class is created and released. The next time they call a different method, the class is created again. That's very good for stateless servers and for servers that have small or quick methods. And in the DataSnap pulling session that I did a couple of days ago, I showed how you can improve the performance in the CAC by using a DataSnap connection pool or session pool. Lastly, server indicates that one class will be created for the entire life of the server. All users connecting in will use that same instance of the class. So if you're doing that, make sure that your class is very thread safe. With the session lifecycle, every time a user connects in and creates a new class, all the connections from that user are running within the same thread. So that's very similar to the DataSnap server, where each user connection was running in its own thread. Using the thread ID, I've created a linked list of session state objects, if you will. So my design is basically, actually I wanted to show this. I stole this design from Thread Local Counter, which is a class in sysutils that works very well. Implements a lightweight, non-blocking local thread storage mechanism. So basically, I can store information and retrieve it based on the thread ID in a manner that's non-blocking and very lightweight. Now, I'm not using this class directly, but my storage class is basically a copy of this thing. And in the code that I upload, I have a full working implementation of this. So essentially, I need to show another unit. There's a storage list that stores objects of T-thread storage. And the way I've designed this is that every server will use the thread storage implementation. However, each server may need to store different state information. So I'll derive a child from thread storage that's unique to each server. So as a user connects in, and the server module's onCreate method, well, the server module itself has a storage field within the class. And then in the onCreate event for that storage class, I call getStorage, which uses the current thread ID to locate the storage object for that connection. And if there's not one already, then one's created. Once I've got that, the main thing that I'm storing, switch back, my apologies, is an ADO connection. So for the primary connection, once I've got the thread storage and I've got the database connection established, I set that in the storage object. And then the child classes, once they have the storage object, they're able to access the ADO connection property and call setConnection to set that on all the ADO related components within that class. Okay, well, it's 9:50. I had some troubleshooting stuff. Let me just jump through this stuff quickly. If you're using Delphi 2009, I highly recommend that you upgrade to Delphi XE. There are just numerous issues and numerous problems and bugs that were fixed since then. Also, a lot of new functionality that 2009 does not have. So I'll leave it at that. If you're using Delphi 2010 and you're seeing performance issues, particularly with the HTTP transport component, then I would upgrade to Delphi XE. Something else that I didn't put on the slide is with before Delphi XE, you cannot use the IAP server and dataset provider functionality if you were using the invocation lifecycle on your server class. Those versions did not support that. Delphi XE does. As I mentioned, ensure that the generated proxy contains all the server methods you expect to be available. If the compiler throws internal errors or access violations occur when a server method is called, but before the first line of the method executes. So if you were looking at the CPU view, that's between the list of parameters, the function definition, and the begin statement. Try to simplify the data types, the parameters that are used by the method. After I upgraded to 2010, I had an access violation that I couldn't explain. One of my method's parameters was an OLE variant, but really an integer would have worked just fine. So in trying to simplify the method itself, I changed the parameter to an integer, updated the proxy in the client application, and the access violation went away. At Delphi Live, I was talking with the architects and mentioned this, and he said that although OLE variant is supported by DB Express, he recommended to avoid it where possible. And then also make sure that none of the server methods are using the safe call calling convention. I highly recommend creating a DUnit test to exercise your DataSnap server. I'd hope to have time to show this, and I don't. But it's really pretty easy. Once you run the DUnit wizard, you point it to the server classes file, the proxy classes file that was generated, and it will create the DUnit framework that calls each one of those classes. And then you add in a little bit of stuff on test start to make the initial SQL connection to the DataSnap server, and you're good to go. We found numerous problems with our initial migration with 2009 this way. A couple of the problems were our own, but unfortunately a lot of the problems were with the DataSnap functionality that was in 2009, which is one of the reasons that I recommend an upgrade. Okay, thank you for attending the session. I apologize for doing this live. I hope it came across well, and I hope you're enjoying CodeRage.
Came across great. Thank you very much, John.
You're welcome.
All right, so let me, I'm trying to steal from you here. I'm going to see if I can grab the screen back. Go back to the slides here. All righty, questions. Awesome, John. You're a live presenting master. I wouldn't change a thing in the session recording. It was real. It was cool. If you want, take the camera like Anders recorded, make a few edits, add the unit test generation for the server message. That would be beyond cool. And I totally agree with that.
Great.
That was awesome. Will the before and after code be available? Also was, yes, the live session was being recorded, absolutely, and it will be provided. So he's asking, will the before and after code be made available somehow?
Yes, I'm going to upload the code from each of my sessions next week to the Code Central.
Great.
And I will include both the before and the after code on this one.
Okay, cool. Could there be an easier way to identify the bad types from the remote data module to DataSnap migrations?
Based on the information I have right now, unfortunately, I don't know of a way. It's common to hear us complain about the documentation, and the documentation in XE is so much better than it ever has been. But this is one area that there's not a lot of documentation as far as what's supported and what's not supported. The blog entry that I mentioned, if you stick with the basic types that are on that blog entry, you're good. Once you branch outside of that area, that it's questionable. The best way that we found was the unit test, because any of the server methods that had types that were not supported blew up during the unit test, and that's how we found all of our issues.
All right. Excellent. I think David wants to go live here with some questions as well.
No questions, because it was too cool. John, I just want to thank you a lot. It's spectacular, and I think it showed everyone a lot of the steps to go through and the mistakes a lot of us make when we're editing code and migrating architectures. It showed it real, and maybe we'll figure out a way to do some parser. I mean, Anders has this parser that he was running when we were doing the Unicode day, so maybe we modify that, Anders, to look for data types for a DataSnap RDM to modern little scanner that could show those things like wide bool or things that showed up. That'd be really awesome.
And then you've also got the difference between 2009 and XE as far as the new DataSnap. It's just light and day. And taking into consideration, it was a whole new architecture with 2009. It's hard to get that stuff right the first time right out of the gate. The third version, it just rocks. So there's stuff that's supported by XE that won't be supported by earlier versions.
Cool. If there's any other questions, feel free to put them in now in the Q&A menu and live meeting while we have John still live on this meeting. If not, then once again, awesome presentation. Thanks for agreeing to doing it live. It came out really well. Yeah, we'll provide the recording, of course. Anything you want to add last minute, last second?
I can't think of anything. I really enjoyed this. Thanks a lot.
Okay, we did too. All right. Thank you very much again.